Good evening, class. We're going to spend some time tonight digging into chapter 12, and the authors refer to chapter 12. It's kind of a generic title to the chapter, and they just named the chapter Factor Markets. But before we get into the factor market discussion, I'm going to go back and review a little bit what we've been talking about over the last few chapters, and especially chapter 11. So we've gone from perfect competition to monopolies. And now in chapter 11, we talked about imperfect competition. And imperfect competition, they just basically define it, at least the authors define it, as a market structure with more than one firm where at least one firm has market power. Makes sense. Think about then I've talked about in the past healthcare. You see it a lot in healthcare, especially hospital systems. You see it a lot in lawyers, legal offices. Think of the big law firms. You see it a lot in consulting, PricewaterhouseCoopers. So you see it, imperfect competition a lot if you just step back and kind of think about the definition of imperfect competition and think about the markets that you're familiar with. And the authors focus mainly on two types of firms, or two types of markets, I guess. They talked about monopolistic competition, and they talked about an oligopoly. Monopolistic competition, there's many sellers. Each seller produces a product that is similar to the product of others, but not exactly identical. So products are differentiated. So when they say not identical, that means they're not perfect substitutes. Entry and exit's easy. Demand for any particular product is highly elastic. And what that means is you can go back to our price elasticity of demand. What that means is you can raise the price some because your product's differentiated, but you can't raise it a whole lot. And typically, in a monopolistic, competitive market, you've got that downward sloping demand curve, and the firms are operating at a position where price is greater than marginal cost. So similar somewhat to a monopoly, in that they're probably not efficiently producing enough output, and they're charging prices that are somewhat higher than consumers should pay, at least from the perspective of policymakers. And then you talk about oligopolies, and it's a situation in which a market is dominated by a few mutually interdependent firms. Industry dominated by a few firms. If it's dominated by only two firms, it's a duopoly. And remember, when we talked about oligopolies, it's the fact that they are mutually interdependent that is one of the main drivers. Firms may produce identical or differentiated products. Substantial barriers to entry because of the brand power and the market power that these oligopolistic types of firms generate, or have structured the markets in such a way, or structured the firms in such a way that they generate market power. And again, it comes back to the mutually interdependent. And basically what that's telling us is the decision of a firm, let's say the decision of your firm. So you make a strategic decision, but the decision you make is also not only going to impact your firm, but it's going to impact the decisions I make in my firm, and vice versa. Decisions I make on my firm's behalf are going to ultimately not only impact my firms, but they're going to impact your firm to a certain extent. So in an oligopolistic market, you have CEOs or presidents of firms, maybe CFOs, or senior VPs of strategic planning. They are always not only thinking about their firm, but they're thinking about other firms in the market and trying to I don't want to say I call it outguess. They're trying to outguess the other firms with respect to the process of strategic planning. Then the text talked for a few minutes about advertising and information, and basically they came to the conclusion, at least the authors did, that advertising socially wasteful. Creates consumer loyalty, it creates brand recognition, but it also creates barriers to entry. Also can increase price competition and consumer price shopping and comparisons if consumers are paying attention to the ads and if the ads contain some type of information, either explicitly or implicitly, that is referring to the price of a given product. Price discrimination is a situation in which a firm charges different prices for the same good or service to different consumers, even though there is no difference in the cost to the firm of supplying these consumers. And spent a few minutes talking about just how colleges and universities structure their financial aid packages. And again, the structure of financial aid packages has generated a fairly significant market niche for these consulting firms that are helping colleges and universities based on information that students are supplying on their application and helping them to determine what financial aid package will be most beneficial to ensure that the student goes to that university as opposed to going to another university. And with that, we're going to wind up the review on chapter, I think it was chapter 11, and we're going to jump into factor markets. And before we jump into the discussion of factor markets, let's go back to, I don't know, chapter 1, chapter 2, maybe it was chapter 3, but one of the earlier chapters in the text, and just review quickly what we're talking about factor markets. And the factors of production will include labor, it'll include capital stock, it may also include what some refer to as this capital in the form of paper, cash, stocks and bonds that a firm will use to purchase capital stock. So economists make sure they differentiate those two. You've got capital stock over here and capital in the form of cash, paper, stocks and bonds, retained earnings that a firm will use to ensure that they have the capital stock they need. You've got the third big category is natural resources. And most people think about natural resources, the first thing you think about is land. So the land that a building is resting on. Think of the land that Fisk sits on. I don't know how big the campus is, maybe, I don't know, just, from what little I've seen of the campus, I haven't walked it in its entirety, but, maybe 40 acres, maybe 40 to 60 acres, somewhere in that range. The buildings that sit on that land, that buildings are considered capital stock, but it's the land that allows the Fisk University to have the buildings that drive into capital stock. And then so you've got kind of the big three on the factors. You've got labor, capital stock, natural resources in the form of land, and that's usually what most people think of. And then you've got sitting over here on the sides, you've got technology and entrepreneurial expertise. And technology, it's not so much iPads, computers, automated processes. Those fall more under the capital stock. Technology is thought of as the expertise in the production process that takes the factors of production, transforms them through the production function, and generates output on the other end. So an economist typically aren't too concerned about what goes on in the black box. They know there's some factors of production. They know there's a production function. Factors of production go into production function, and output comes out the other side of the black box. But from a profit maximizing firm perspective, they are definitely thinking about the expertise that's embedded in this technological driver that drives this production function. And then also you've got over here entrepreneurial expertise that are constantly tweaking with the technology and the production function to try to improve efficiency, try to improve the output that goes out the door. So you've got the big three, and then you've got technology of the in the production process, and you've got entrepreneurial expertise. So that kind of brings us back to what we learned in some of the earlier chapters in the book. And the authors jump into this particular chapter, and they say any firm that produces goods and services needs to hire what? Workers. Because remember, go back to even your competitive market. What is the easiest thing to change typically for a firm? If you think about the factors of production, it's the labor supply. The labor supply is the easiest thing to change. Maybe if you have a union shop, it may not be the easiest thing to change. But again, even with the union shop, it's probably easier to change than changing the capital stock and maybe changing the natural resources. So labor is, and we talked about it throughout the book, or throughout some of the earlier texts anyway, and especially in the short run, labor is the variable that can change, and all the other factors of production are fixed. Now, when we go to the long run, all of the factors of production are considered variables. So depends on what you're talking about. And in the text, I think they're starting it out. They're trying again. As good economists do, they are talking about a very simplistic market, but the market and the concepts that they use for labor can be applied to any of the factors of production. They just choose labor because it's one that even in the short run can be varied, as opposed to trying to vary maybe some of the other factors of production. More output, in theory, the more workers you use, and the more workers, it tends to be labor, whether it's unskilled workers or skilled workers, depending on the type of firm you have, depending on the type of products that you have. If you've got a landscaping business, maybe you don't need a lot of skilled workers. If you've got a company in Silicon Valley that's generating software and writing codes, and you're going to need a lot of skilled workers. So it's going to depend on the market, the industry, the type of firm you work for. You hire labor until the extra revenue no longer exceeds the extra cost of the labor, right? Remember, we go all the way back to one of the earlier chapters. We were talking about the marginal product of labor, right? Change in the output divided by the change in labor. And what happens is additional firm, as you hire additional workers, it increases the output, and the size of the increase reverts back to the definition we had as the marginal product of labor. So you hire additional workers, increases the output, and the size of the increase in that output is the marginal product of labor. Again, change in output divided by change in labor. New output sells and adds to total revenue. And so that increases the firm's total revenue. Remember, profit, when you're looking at profit, what was the mathematical function for profit? Mathematical function, total revenue minus total cost. Could be, I'll call it, could be outlined a different way or notated a different way. Profit equals total revenue minus, and you put in parentheses, total fixed cost plus total variable cost. And again, if you're talking about, and that's from the accounting side, and if you get into the, when you're talking about an economist look at profit, so remember we talked about the accountants look at profit, they just look at explicit costs that have generated an invoice or costs that has generated an outlay of some kind for on the cost side of the process. Economists also look at the implicit cost. Now, the implicit costs are really the opportunity cost, and we've talked about that in some earlier chapters. The margin, and they'll give you in the text, again, I hope some of you are actually reading the text. There are some, I've added some notes onto the to your Canvas portal. And I'm going to be adding these videos to the Canvas portal. But you've all got links to that textbook, and I hope you purchased that textbook. And if you have purchased it, I actually hope you've been reading it along. Marginal revenue product of labor, and they, acronym is MRP with a little subscript for L. It's the amount that an additional unit of labor adds to the firm's total revenue during a period. And they say generally, the formula for the marginal revenue product of labor is the marginal product of labor times the marginal revenue. Make sense? How an additional unit, so it goes back to the definition, the amount that an additional unit of labor adds to a firm's total revenue during a period. And that ends up with the formula. If you're talking about a perfectly competitive firm, remember the price, the demand curve is flat, horizontal. So I'll call it horizontal. I hear some people say it's flat, but at that point, price is equal to marginal revenue. So if you're looking at a perfectly competitive firm, what does the formula look like for the marginal revenue product of labor? Marginal product of labor times price, because in a perfectly competitive market, price is equal to marginal revenue. If marginal product of labor is falling, so if we've hit that diminishing marginal returns on your labor, if it's falling, then by definition, the marginal revenue product of labor is falling also. And then, so you've got the marginal revenue product of labor. That's going to be driving your revenue side of that profit function. And on the cost side, you're looking at the marginal factor cost, the MFC. The amount that an additional unit of labor, they say just of a factor, but since we're talking about, we're going to say labor, adds to a firm's total cost per period. The formula for the marginal factor cost is equal to the change in the total cost divided by the change in the units of factor. Higher until the marginal revenue product of labor is equal to the marginal factor cost. Just another way of saying higher into, or your profit maximizing firms are going to produce until marginal revenue equals marginal cost. At that point, not only is profit maximized, but the net benefits to society have been maximized also. And then they spend just a few minutes talking about shifts in labor demand. In perfect competition, anything affecting the marginal product of labor or output price will shift the demand of labor. Makes sense from a definition perspective. Change in the use of other factors of production drives some of it. If it's complementary factors of production for which an increase in the use of one increases the demand for the other. Remember, we were talking about complementary goods, similar concept. And it applies, they've just taken that, the definition we had for complementary goods and just tweaked it a little, and now are applying it to the factors of production. Substitute factors of production is which an increase in the use of one goes down, then an increase of one, let me see what this says, factors of production for which an increase in the use of one decreases the demand for other. Remember, you're substituting. Almost confused myself on my notes. But again, complements, they run, remember how we talked about complementary goods, move in the same direction. One goes up, the other goes up, one goes down, the other goes down. Substitutes, one increases, the other decreases. One decreases, the other increases. Similar concept, they're just talking about factors of production, and in this case, labor, but it goes back to the way we work with complementary and substitute goods and services. Changes in technology. If you increase economy's output, you're increasing the marginal product of labor. For those employees with the required technical skills, increased demand for skilled workers decreases the demand for less skilled workers. And that makes sense too. If you increase technology, you've got to have more skill. And the option that I guess any firm has, but especially a profit maximizing firm, at some point they have a decision to make. If they've increased technology and they need more skill in the workforce that they have hired to generate output, they have one or two choices. They either eliminate some of the less skilled workers and they hire on additional skilled workers, or what's the other option? Increase human capital, training, education, credentialing, additional maybe courses at a technical school or additional college level courses. You basically have two choices. Either look at your workforce, and if you need more skilled workers, you're going to almost have to, and you're trying to keep a budget somewhere constant, you're going to have to lay off enough unskilled workers to hire these skilled workers you need, or you take some of those unskilled workers that you see have potential and improve not only their human capital, but improve the human capital of the skilled workers that you already have. So it goes back to profit maximizing firms from a hiring and firing perspective. A lot of times it is more cost effective to increase the human capital of the employees that they currently have. Changes in product demand, a change in demand of the final product will increase what? Increase the price in the short run. Changes in the number of firms, if you increase the number of firms, it increases the demand for the factors of production. More firms in a market, you're going to have more factors of production to go around. And it works for any factor, not just labor. It works for capital stock. It works for natural resources. And at that point, you've got the demand curve shifting up and down, shifting right, shifting left. And we'll get into it in some of the later parts of this chapter. You're going to see that the supply curve shifts right and left too. If the demand so we'll go back and let's think about it. If the demand for the final product goes up and the price goes up, right? More demand raises the price. If the price goes up because you're demanding more, it also increases the marginal product of labor. And as the marginal product of labor goes up, you're going to have a demand for labor going up. And with that, we're going to stop. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the supply of labor. Talk to everybody in a few minutes.